I had just turned 23, and I was living in a small apartment on the top floor of a house with my two friends Mark and Larson. We had moved in a few months earlier, and it seemed like a good deal at the time. The rent was cheap, and the location was decent. However, we quickly realized that our living situation was far from perfect. The couple who lived on the ground floor, Sean and Claire, were a constant source of frustration. They were in their early 30s and seemed to be drunk almost every night. They would argue and yell at each other at all hours of the night, and it was almost impossible to get any sleep. Mark had tried to talk to Sean one time, asking him to be quiet, but he got really angry and told us to mind our own business. After that, we tried our best to ignore them, but it was tough. I invested in a good pair of earplugs, but it was still bad. This went on for a while. I would run into Sean and Claire from time to time, but they were incredibly unfriendly. I guess they were still mad about Mark. I got a bad feeling from Sean. He seemed dangerous, and I was actually kind of afraid for Claire's safety. I told myself that it was none of my business though, so I tried to ignore them. One night I woke up in the middle of the night. Not unusual for the reasons I explained before, but this was different. It was a loud crash coming from the front of our place. It was like the door had been kicked in. I was pretty sure someone was breaking into our apartment. I quickly got out of bed and walked to my bedroom door. I opened it a crack and peeked through to the living room. That's when I saw Sean standing there. He was in his underwear and he was holding a gun. I looked for a few seconds. He was fighting to stand up straight, obviously drunk. I quietly moved back from the door and closed it, hoping he didn't see me. I grabbed my phone and called the police. When they arrived, Sean was still in the living room. He was yelling incoherently, but he had put the gun down before the police arrived. Probably the smartest thing he did that night. The police officers arrested him. After that night, we were all really scared. We were wondering if Sean would try to get back at us. We talked to the landlord about the situation, and he seemed concerned, but gave us some non-committal promise, like, "I promise I'll look into it," or something like that. Lucky for us, Sean was kept in police custody for a while. A few days after the incident, Claire moved out of the house. We still don't know why. My guess was that she was too embarrassed to stay. Understandable. We talked to the landlord after that, and he told us that they broke the lease. About a month later, a group of international students moved in downstairs. We didn't hear a sound from them the entire time they were there. Looking back on that time, it's hard to believe that it all happened. It was scary and creepy. We never found out what happened to Sean. Mark said he was only charged with a misdemeanor, or something minor like that. It seems wrong to me. The guy broke into our place drunk with a gun. How is that not a more serious offense? I just hope I never see him again. I moved my family to a new city a few years ago. I got a new job that let me work from home, so we chose a neighborhood based on price and quality of the schools. My kids were 2 and 4 years old at the time, so we didn't have to uproot their lives or anything. It was the right time to make a move, and we found a nice house in a residential area that was not too far outside of the city. On one side, our neighbors were a retired couple that had been in their house for decades. They were nice enough, but kept to themselves. No problem for us. I think a number of the other neighbors were retired as well, but one of our neighbors on the other side of the house were a group of college guys. They offered to help us move some boxes when we first moved in. The college was about a 25-minute bus ride away from our place, so I was surprised when we found out that our neighbors were students. We bought the place knowing that, though. We came to regret it eventually. The first weekend when we were there, they threw a loud party, and we could hear thumping music from our bedroom. I got out of bed and looked out the window. There were people in the front yard and on the street partying and drinking. I couldn't believe they were able to do that without any of the other neighbors calling the police. My wife thought that some of the elderly people were hard of hearing and better able to tolerate the noise. It was loud though, so loud that you could feel it. We tolerated the noise that night, hoping it would be a once-off thing. But a few weeks later, they had a particularly loud party. We could feel the vibrations from their speakers and shouting from our bedroom. At 2 a.m., I had enough, and I decided to go and ask them to tone it down. I walked over to their house, trying to keep calm despite the loud music. I think it's fair to talk face to face before calling the police, especially because the guys had been generally friendly so far. I walked up to the house and knocked on the door. One of the guys opened it. He had a red plastic cup in his hand. I asked him politely to turn down the music. He shrugged and said,
"Why? It's a party."
I explained that the noise was keeping my family awake, but he just laughed and said,
"Tough luck, buddy."
He was clearly drunk. As I turned to leave, one of the guys made a crude comment that made me turn back around. I was determined not to let them disrespect me or my family. I know I should have let it go, but I got angry and walked up to him. "What did you say?" I asked him, my voice steady despite the adrenaline.
"You heard me, old man,"
he said, puffing out his chest. I knew I had to leave before things got ugly, so I turned around and walked back to my house. I was angry and frustrated, but I tried to let it go and get some sleep. Things were awkward after that. I didn't talk to them again for a week or so. I had been busy working at my home office, and I didn't see them much. On another weekend, the party started again. This time it was even worse than before. They had brought in a DJ, and the music was blasting so loud that I could hear it like I was right there at the party. This time I called the police to report a noise complaint, hoping they would take it seriously. When the police arrived, they asked the guys to turn down the music, but as soon as the police left, the music got even louder. It's as if they were doing it on purpose, just to spite us. We called again, but this time when the police came back, they had turned it down before they got there. I think they saw the police coming and turned it down to get one over on me. A few days later, I noticed that our house had been vandalized. Eggs were splattered all over our porch, and my wife's flower pots were destroyed. I was shocked and scared. It was clear that they were targeting us. The following week, we started to get prank calls in the middle of the night. Around that time, we started receiving threatening letters in our mailbox. Things took an even more serious turn one night in late October. It was the night before Halloween, and our neighbors were having a relatively tame party. At around midnight, we heard a loud crash coming from the front of our house. I was still working in my office, which was in the basement. I ran upstairs to the sound and saw that someone had thrown a brick through our window. I called the police. We had security cameras installed after the vandalism incident, so we had footage that covered most of the exterior of our house. Upon checking the video, it was clear that one of the guys had thrown the brick. His face was there, clear as day. The police arrested the guy responsible, and he was charged with vandalism and destruction of property, as well as making threats. We were relieved that he had been caught, but we were still living next to the other guys. They had no respect for our property or our peace of mind. It was clear that we needed to take matters into our own hands. We decided to talk to the landlord of the house next door and see if he could do something about the constant noise and the behavior of his tenants. The landlord was aware of the situation, and he had been receiving complaints from some of the other neighbors as well. He had warned the tenants before, but they had not changed. He assured us that he would take action and deal with the tenants. Eventually, we noticed that the guys were no longer living in the house. The landlord evicted them for breaching their lease agreement. We were thrilled that we could finally enjoy some peace and quiet in our own home. As we settled into our new life without the bad neighbors, we made an effort to get to know the other families on the block. It was a really bad experience. My wife and I were concerned for our children. We were lucky that things didn't go farther. When I was younger, A scary incident happened to me and my two friends, Will and Jim. It was summer vacation of 2006, and we were in the 7th grade. Will lived a few houses down from me, and Jim was about a half-hour walk away, or about a 10-minute bike ride. The three of us would spend most days together in the summer, just walking around the neighborhood, maybe seeing a movie if we had the money. Our neighborhood was pretty safe. We didn't know all of our neighbors. I pretty much only knew the people who had kids around my age. There was one guy who lived on my street that was really creepy though. He was a strange man who lived a few houses down from Will and me. His name was Gary, and he was quiet, kept to himself. We rarely saw him leave his house. He was not that old, maybe around 60 if I had to guess. His appearance was extremely shabby. He had long bushy hair and a wild beard. There was something off about him. I remember seeing him staring out his window at the kids who played on the street, and it made me feel strange. He would never say anything, but I could always feel his gaze on me. One day, Jim, Will, and I were on our way to the corner store to buy some candy, one of our standard summer activities. It was a hot summer day, and we didn't have anything better to do. We decided to take a shortcut through Gary's yard, which was overgrown with weeds and looked abandoned. Our parents always told us to stay out of Gary's yard, but we did it anyway. Sue me. We were about halfway through when we heard a noise behind us. We turned around, and there was Gary, standing on the edge of his yard. His eyes were wild, and he was waving his arms around like he was trying to scare us off.
Get out of my yard,
he yelled. We turned around and started to run, but Will tripped over a rock and fell. Jim and I kept running, and we turned back when we got to the street. We thought Will was just behind us, but I was wrong. I looked back in disbelief and saw that Gary was dragging Will by the arm towards his house. Jim and I didn't know what to do. We were scared, and we didn't want to go into Gary's house, but we knew we had to get help. We ran to my house and told my parents what happened. They called the police right away, and we waited anxiously for them to arrive. When they got there, they found Will tied to a chair in Gary's kitchen. Will told me that the place was an absolute mess. There were old newspapers and trash piled everywhere. He was only in there for a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes, but he said it was the worst experience of his entire life. He had no idea what Gary was going to do to him. Gary was arrested on the spot for kidnapping, but unfortunately, he wasn't charged. Some technicality about the fact that we were on his property was the reason he got off. I get that we shouldn't have been there, but if what he did wasn't a red flag, then I don't know what is. That guy was dangerous. We were all terrified to be in that neighborhood, not just me and my friends. After that, things were not the same on our street. Parents kept a closer eye on their children, and we were all scared to go anywhere near Gary's house. We would still see him staring out his window. It was a really bad time. A few months later, Gary moved out of his house. We were all relieved that he was gone. It wasn't until later that we heard that his kids had put him in a retirement home. I guess they heard about what happened, and they were concerned. Credit to them for stepping in before something really bad happened. My name is Andrew, and my wife's name is Katie. We moved to a quiet suburban neighborhood about 15 years ago. We found the perfect house on a nice street. It was farther out of the city than we were used to, but we were looking forward to it. This was before we had children, and we were looking for a place to start a family. When we first moved in, we met some of the neighbors. They were mostly older, but nobody that we really clicked with. But there was one neighbor that we never quite got along with. His name was Frank, and he lived 2 doors down from us. From the moment we moved in, he made it clear that he didn't like us. He would give us dirty looks whenever we saw him, and he would also make remarks about us to our other neighbors. One of our other neighbors, Travis, didn't get along with him either. He warned us about Frank early on, and it turned out that Travis was right. At first we tried to ignore him, thinking that maybe he was just having a bad day, but as time went on, his behavior became more aggressive. He would park his car in front of our house, blocking our driveway. But he said casually that he would be back in a few hours, as if it was a normal thing to block us in for hours. He would also let his dog bark loudly early in the morning and late at night, waking us up. We tried talking to him about that, but he just brushed it off as well, saying that he had the right to do what he wanted on his own property. We felt like he was trying to bother us, trying to provoke a reaction out of us. We talked about it, and decided not to give in to our urges to fight back. We didn't want to give him the satisfaction. Then, things started to escalate. Katie was home alone one afternoon. I worked weekends, and she would be home alone most of the time. One day when I was at work, Frank tried to break into our house. She had just finished taking a shower and was getting dressed when she heard someone trying to force open our back door. She looked out the window and saw that it was Frank. He was slamming into our door in broad daylight. Katie said that he looked up and saw her watching him. When they locked eyes, he stopped and started shouting at her, accusing her of poisoning his dog. There was absolutely no way that she did. If anything, maybe it was one of our other neighbors who he was harassing. This guy had problems, and we weren't the only ones who didn't like him. Katie was terrified. She could hear Frank's footsteps outside, and she knew that he was determined to get in. She barricaded herself in our bedroom and tried to calm down. She called the police, but he took off before they arrived. Since she didn't think fast enough to get a recording, it was his word against hers, so they couldn't do anything. After that incident, we decided to move away. We didn't want to let him win, but we decided that we couldn't allow our future children to grow up around that guy. We sold our house at a loss, but it was worth it. We had to get out. It took us a few months, but we eventually found a new home in a different neighborhood. We packed up our things and said goodbye to our old life, hoping that we would never have to experience anything like that again. Looking back on that time in our lives, I still feel angry. We had moved into that neighborhood with such high hopes, but in the end, we were forced to leave because of one person's problems. As for Frank, I don't know what happened to him. We obviously never spoke to him again after we left. I don't really care to know. All I know is that we're happy to be safe in our new home, surrounded by people who care about us, and a sense of peace that we never had in our old neighborhood. This story will stay with me until I die. I still think about it a lot, and I try to consider how I could have prevented it. But to this day, I haven't figured it out. To understand me better, you need to know that I was raised with an epileptic mother, so I was conditioned from a young age to react when I heard a loud noise. It usually meant my mother was having a seizure. I moved in with my brother after I separated from my boyfriend. My brother lived on the second floor of a 3-story building. Every apartment had its own entrance to the outside, and to get to my brother's apartment, the stairs were on the outside of the building. Then to get to the 3rd floor of the apartment building, you had to enter the apartment door to access the staircase. All 3 doors had a window that you could see through. I had been there for about a month, and since I moved in, I had never heard anything from the upstairs neighbor. I saw him a few times, and we exchanged nods while passing each other, either on the outside balcony, or when we would pass each other on the stairs. But I never really exchanged any words with him or anything. Then one day, I heard a really loud thud come from the apartment upstairs. Before I could even think about it, years of living with my mother kicked in, and I ran to the door to ring the upstairs apartment's doorbell. A young teenage girl who I had never seen before opened the door. I told her who I was, and I asked if everything was okay, since I'd heard a really loud noise. She turned around and yelled for her mom. Her mother, who I had never seen before either, appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing her knee. She apologized for the noise, and told me that she had just moved in with her boyfriend, and she kept bumping into the coffee table. It looked like she felt really bad for having disturbed me, so I told her it was all good, and let her know not to hesitate if she needed anything. I don't know why I told her that. I must have felt something was off. I was proven right just 4 days later. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a really loud noise coming from the upstairs apartment. My brother had gone to his girlfriend's house for the night, so I was by myself. The noise sounded like they were moving furniture around. It was crazy. There was no way in hell I was going to ring their doorbell at 3 a.m., so I called the police and let them know something was wrong. It was strange because I usually never hear anything from the upstairs neighbor. They told me they were sending a patrol car as soon as possible, and for me to stay in my apartment. They then told me to call back if the situation changed. What happened next still haunts me. As soon as I hung up with the police, I heard thuds as if somebody was running in place, and then I heard a woman scream for help. I then realized that the noise I was hearing was probably her feet hitting the floor repeatedly while she was trying to fight back. I took the phone and called the police again, and I told the dispatcher that the lady was screaming for help. While I was on the phone with the police, the noises stopped. 4 police cars arrived within a minute. The station was only a few blocks away. An ambulance got there about a minute after them. I saw the police take my neighbor out in handcuffs. He was thrashing and screaming and trying to break away. I also saw the paramedics leave with the woman. About an hour later, the detectives came to talk to me and get my statement. I asked about the woman. She had been pronounced dead at the hospital. I started crying and told the detectives that I should have gone to ring the doorbell. Maybe it would have gotten his attention away from her. However, they told me that the guy's plan had been to kill her. He was looking for the teenage girl when the police got there. She had been hiding downstairs in the dark under the window. If I had rang the doorbell, I would have called him right to the child. Besides, I'm a 5'5" woman. The man was 6 feet tall. What more could I have done to help? The detectives tried to comfort me by telling me that I had done the only thing I could do. I had tried to help by calling the police early. They had already been en route by the time the lady lost consciousness, so I probably saved that teenager's life. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. Her name was Isabel. She was 29 years old when she died. 18 years ago, last month. This happened to me and my family a long time ago, when I was 12 years old. I lived in a suburban neighborhood with my parents and my younger sister Melanie. We had lived there since I was a baby, and I knew everyone on the block. That was until a new family moved in one summer. It was a mother, father, and 2 kids. The boy's name was Brian, and the girl's name was Jen. Brian was my age, and Jen was Melanie's age. We all became friends quickly, and played together every day during the summer. Eventually, the summer ended, and we had to go back to school. I was happy to introduce Brian to everyone. One day, though, we had a fight in the schoolyard. I don't even remember what it was about, but a few punches were thrown. Neither of us really got hurt, but it was effectively the end of our friendship. The other kids took my side because Brian was the new guy. Later that week, Brian's mom drove up to me as I was walking home from school. She got out of the car and yelled at me for 5 minutes straight, accusing me of bullying her son. I didn't know what to do or say, so I just stood there and listened until she left. There was no way I was bullying him. We got into a fight, that was all. I figured that he told on me, and that was super lame. Over the coming weeks, my family's house was vandalized on several occasions. Our mailbox was knocked over, we found eggs splattered on the house, and our lawn decorations were destroyed. We thought that Brian's family was doing it, but we didn't have any proof. One time, I was walking past Brian's house, and his mom came out and started yelling at me again. I told her to F off, and I tried to walk away, but she grabbed me by the arm and started pulling me towards her house. I struggled, but I was only 12 years old, and she was bigger than me. I was terrified, because I thought that lady had a few screws loose. I didn't know what she would do to me. I managed to get away, and I ran home as fast as I could. When I told my parents what happened, they were furious. They called the police and reported what had been happening. But when the police arrived, they treated it like a regular dispute and said there wasn't much they could do. We felt helpless and scared. We didn't know what Brian's family was capable of, or what they might do next. One day when I was home alone, I heard a knock at the front door. I looked through the front window and saw Brian's mom standing there with a crazed look in her eyes. She started pounding on the door and yelling at me to open it. I knew I had to do something, so I ran to the back of the house and locked all the doors and windows. I was shaking and scared out of my mind. I didn't know if she was going to break in, or what she might do if she did. Eventually she stopped pounding on the door and left. I called my parents and told them everything. They came home immediately and called the police again, and again. They didn't do anything. Things went on like this for about a year. It was a terrible time in my childhood. Brian's mom would show up at our house while my parents were away. It got to the point where we were not allowed outside when my parents weren't home. We all thought that Brian's mom was a little crazy, and my parents were worried that she was dangerous. It all ended in an unfortunate way. Brian's dad died. We never knew the details of what happened to him, but foul play was never suspected. Because of that, their family couldn't afford to stay in our neighborhood, since the mom didn't work. They were forced to sell the house and move into an apartment. Years later, I saw Brian at a party when I was in the 12th grade. We went to different high schools, but somehow we had some friends in common. We were able to move past our differences and had a decent conversation. Neither of us brought up what happened back then, though. I was especially careful to be respectful, considering how things went for Brian and his family. My neighborhood was quiet and generally considered safe, but not the friendliest place. I had a few friends among my neighbors, but there were a lot of people who I didn't know at all. There was one really weird guy. He was about 45 years old, but he lived with his parents who were elderly. Sam was about average height, but overweight. He dressed like he was a lot younger, with baggy pants and a backwards hat. My parents always told me not to talk to him, but I didn't understand why at first. He seemed harmless enough, just a little odd. Sam and his parents lived around the corner from me. There were 5 or 6 houses separating us, but his backyard backed onto ours. There was a tall wooden fence separating our yards, though. I didn't see it as weird that an older guy like that was living with his parents until I was older. Sam had a modified pickup truck that was lowered, and my friends and I actually thought it was pretty cool. We always obeyed our parents, though, and we never really talked to him. Eventually, I started to notice things about Sam that made me uneasy. He would stare at me and my friends when we were playing outside. Spend a lot of time on his driveway, working on his truck, but now that I look back, I think he was faking it. Sometimes he would make strange noises or gestures at me and my friends as we passed by. My parents continued to warn me to stay away from him, and eventually I understood why. One day when I was at home alone watching TV, I heard a strange noise from outside. Our living room was at the back of the house, and there was a gate blocking it off from the street. I got up to investigate the noise, and that's when I saw Sam. He was walking up to the window and looking in. I was stunned. Then I realized that the back door was unlocked. I quickly ran over to the door and tried to lock it, but Sam was already trying to open it. I could hear him laughing maniacally as he struggled with me. It was almost like it was a joke to him, but I was terrified. I tried to push him away, but he was too strong. His grip on the door was unbreakable. In a moan of desperation, I let go of the door and it swung open. The doorknob slammed into the wall, making a big dent that I later found. Then Sam came inside. I ran to the front of the house and out the front door. I slammed the door behind me, hoping it would slow him down if he tried to chase me. I'm still not sure if he did. I sprinted to my friend's place, and we called the cops. I was shaking and crying as I told him what happened. They came over to my house and caught Sam leaving through the back door. He was arrested on the spot. I never saw Sam again after that day. His parents kicked him out of the house after they found out what he did. I don't know what happened to him, but I was glad that he was no longer a threat to me or anyone else in my neighborhood. My guess is that he's terrorizing someone else now. Not the ideal outcome. He really should be locked up, but the charge for breaking into a house did not carry the kind of punishment that it should have. It's scary to think about what could have happened if I wasn't able to get away. I'm sure he would have done something to me. He didn't even steal anything, so it wasn't about that. It's been years since that day, but I still remember it vividly. I still get a little scared when I'm alone in that house, but I know I'm safe now. His parents are still in the neighborhood. It's pretty awkward being around them, but nobody ever talks about Sam. Everyone in my neighborhood understands that it's off limits. When my wife and I decided to purchase our first home, we decided on a nice condo in a new part of town. This was about a year ago. We were excited to start our lives in this cozy space, and the building itself seemed perfect with its charming brick facade and modern amenities. We never could have imagined the nightmare that was about to unfold. It started innocuously enough. We noticed a neighbor across the hall who always seemed to be lingering in the hallway. He was around our age. We were in our mid-30s. He had long black hair that was always tied back, and a short beard, with glasses. He dressed casually, but stylish as well. He seemed like a normal guy at first, not the type who would turn out to be such a psycho. We tried to be friendly and strike up a conversation, but he always seemed to brush us off and retreat back to his apartment. Things escalated quickly from there. We began to notice our neighbor peeking through the peephole in our door whenever we saw him in the hallway. I'm still not sure what he was trying to do, because I tried, and I couldn't see anything through that peephole from the outside. It was still creepy though, and I started to think he was a little crazy. We would often see him just standing outside our door doing nothing, just looking at the ground. It got so bad that my wife was too scared to go out when he was there. I don't even blame her. It was really bad. We tried to confront our neighbor, but he always seemed to be elusive. Whenever we brought it up, he would simply deny it and accuse us of exaggerating. We filed a complaint with the building management, but they seemed dismissive of our concerns and told us they couldn't do anything unless we had evidence of a crime. The situation became increasingly frightening. One night, we heard footsteps outside our door at around 2 a.m. When we looked out, we saw our neighbor standing right out in front of the door, again not doing anything. I get that it's not against the law to stand in the hallway of a building where you live, but it was really weird and scary for us. We were out of ideas, so we decided to contact the police in the morning. Unfortunately, there was little they could do. One night the next week, we woke to the sound of loud banging on our door. We both suspected that it was the neighbor, and we were right. He was slamming his body into our door at full force. My wife pulled out her phone to call the police, and I pressed my body against the door to keep it from smashing off the hinges. We were both really worried that he would break it down. The police arrived while he was still slamming into the door. They arrested him on the spot for trying to break in. We never found out exactly what his problem was, but for some reason, he had a problem with us. Luckily, we never saw that guy again. He was actually renting, and when the owner of his place found out what happened, he was evicted and had to move out. This happened almost 5 years ago, but I still can't get it out of my mind. It was the scariest and creepiest thing that ever happened to me by far. I lived in a modest apartment in an older building. It had character, with its creaking wooden floors and other quirks. The building itself was nothing special. In fact, My only window faced an alley with another building really close to it. There was no view to speak of. The interior was quite outdated as well. It was clean though. No rodents or bedbugs, but the style was pretty ugly. The wood floors were worn and uneven. One of my walls was covered with a fake brick siding that seemed to be vinyl. There were several cracks and holes throughout it. It was a real eyesore. The location was pretty excellent though. It was close to downtown in my city, right on the subway line, and there was a nice park across the street. It was on the second floor, which was also the top floor. The building housed only 5 apartments, which meant that I encountered my neighbors frequently. Among them was Henry, a man in his 40s who resided next door. We shared a wall on one side. From the moment I moved in, I felt uneasy whenever we crossed paths. Henry was a quiet man. His presence unnerved me, but I could never put my finger on why. The occasional glimpses exchanged in the hallway sent shivers down my spine, and I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable whenever our eyes met. I tried to be friendly at first, but it was like playing handball against the drapes. I couldn't get through to him, so eventually I stopped trying. After a month or two, we would hardly acknowledge each other in passing. It was really weird. All of my other neighbors would at least say hi. One day when I came home from work, I was surprised to see that Henry's door was open. I was concerned at first, thinking he was coming out. I wanted to avoid seeing him whenever possible. But when I passed the apartment, I looked in, and I saw that it was completely empty. He had moved out. I went out to the parking area, and his car was gone too. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I could finally breathe easier within the confines of my own home. I wasn't surprised that it came so suddenly. He wouldn't have told anybody if he was going to move. That wasn't strange at all. I was just happy he was gone. A few days after Henry's departure, the landlord informed me that he would be conducting a thorough cleaning of the vacant apartment. It was routine maintenance, ensuring the unit was in prime condition for the next tenant. He just wanted to warn me that there would be some noise. He showed up on a Saturday with another man, his brother, I think. I was at home on my computer. There was some noise from the vacuum and some footsteps. The walls were pretty thin. It was no big deal though. After a few hours of that, there was a knock at my door. I got up and answered it. It was my landlord, and he had a strange look on his face. His eyes reflected a mixture of concern and disbelief. He motioned for me to step outside into the hallway, and then he asked me to follow him into Henry's apartment. I did what he said. With a hushed tone, the landlord explained the reason for his visit. He had discovered a hole in the wall, leading from Henry's apartment to mine. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. I almost fell over. The implication was clear. Henry had been spying on me. He showed me the hole. It had clearly been drilled on purpose. It was perfectly round. There was no way it was an accident. Another weird thing is that my landlord told me that it was just stuffed with a paper towel. Henry didn't even put any effort into covering his tracks. I wondered why I didn't notice it from my place. When I went back to check, I noticed that the hole was just behind that horrible fake brick siding, and it was able to see through one of the many cracks. The landlord assured me that the hole would be sealed. However, the emotional wounds left behind would take much longer to heal. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The paranoia lingered in my mind for a long time. My landlord contacted the police, but there was nothing they could do. Henry was not the only person to live there. There was no way to prove that he was the one who made the hole, or that he ever looked through it. I know it was him, though. He lived there before me, so it's hard to think of who else would have done it. My worst fear is that some video of me will come up online. I don't think they got anything really embarrassing because of the placement of the hole, but I'm not really sure. The thought of it haunts me every day. I moved to a new neighborhood with my 13-year-old son Sam, seeking a fresh start and a sense of belonging. I was about a year out from my divorce at the time, and we had been in a one-bedroom apartment for about 6 months. This house was a big step up for us, and I was happy to give Sam a sense of home. I think that was missing before. We were renting, but it was a really nice place. It was a quaint and peaceful community, with rows of townhouses and well-manicured lawns. The neighbors seemed friendly, and I hoped Sam would find a place among the other kids. As luck would have it, there was another boy in our neighborhood around Sam's age, named Matt. His parents introduced themselves to me, and we struck up a friendship. Sam and Matt also became friends soon. It was a relief to see Sam connecting with someone else in our area, and I felt hopeful that this would work out well for him. Things were alright for a while. Sam and Matt would hang out in our neighborhood most evenings. They went to the same school as well, so as far as I knew, they were really good friends. However, one day, Sam came home visibly upset. His eyes were filled with tears, and his face was etched with distress. I immediately knew something was wrong, and gently coaxed him to share what had transpired. Reluctantly, he confessed that he was no longer friends with Matt, but remained tight-lipped about the reason for his sudden change. I respected Sam's decision, even though I was concerned about what had caused this rift between them. I'm not an expert on young male friendships. I know what I was seeing was just the surface. Most kids put on an innocent face for grown-ups. My guess was that they had a fight over something and needed some time apart. I didn't worry about it. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a much more disturbing ordeal that would consume our lives. It began innocently enough, with Matt lingering around outside our house. He would just hover on the street, watching through the windows. He wasn't really doing anything in particular, just standing there, usually alone, but sometimes with another boy from the neighborhood. Sam grew increasingly anxious, and neither of us felt comfortable leaving our home. Then one day, Sam told me something terrifying. Trembling with fear, he revealed that Matt had been bragging at school about how he was going to kill Sam. I was troubled by this, but I thought it was just talk. I was still concerned enough to do something, though. The more I thought about it, the more scared I was. My instincts went into overdrive, and I immediately contacted the school, desperate to make sure Sam was safe. The school principal was already aware of the situation. The next day, I heard that they searched Matt's school bag and locker. What they found was downright chilling. The school discovered several weapons in Matt's backpack and locker, including a large knife, and what appeared to be an attempt to make some kind of explosive. That kid was planning something terrible. The school took swift action, expelling Matt and reporting the incident to the authorities. It was a bittersweet victory. It meant that Sam would be safe, but it also meant that his sense of security had been shattered. Matt's parents decided to send him to a treatment facility. There was some hope that he would receive the help he needed. Months later, when he eventually returned to the neighborhood, a heavy cloud hung in the air. We were not excited to see him, to say the least. Weeks went by, and Matt never said a word to either of us. He didn't so much as glance in our direction. It was somewhat chilling in a different way. Before, he was one of the biggest loudmouths on the street. Now he was quiet and withdrawn. The complete opposite of before. It's been over a year now, and nothing else has happened. I hope every day that Matt has changed, but every time I see him, I can't help but remember what he did. I wonder if there are dark thoughts beneath the surface, waiting to come out. This happened when I was just 15 years old. I lived with my parents and my 10-year-old brother, Ben. Our little neighborhood was a peaceful place. Most of our neighbors were families like us. But there was one old woman a few doors down. We'll just call her Sarah. She was probably about 90 years old, but still lived in a house. About 6 months before this story starts, her son Daryl moved in to act as her caregiver. He was in his 50s, about 6 feet tall, with a heavy build. We introduced ourselves when he moved in, but didn't see much of him after that. My parents were not close with Sarah or anything. We would just see her around now and then. Less often than before, since her mobility had declined around that time, hence the need for a caregiver. One afternoon, Ben and I returned from school. It was around 5 o'clock. Our parents were not home yet. Our father usually got back at around 5:30 or 6, and our mom would be back after 6 on most days. Ben and I were in the living room watching TV. It was some kids' show for Ben. I wasn't really paying attention, just keeping him company. Suddenly the front door swung open. That was weird, because our parents would usually enter through the door leading to the garage, since they both drove to work. I was concerned, because I thought someone was breaking in. I got up from the couch and walked out of the living room. As soon as I turned the corner, I was face to face with Daryl. I was speechless. He stood there in front of me, swaying. The smell of alcohol was impossible to ignore. Even me at 15 years old could tell this guy was drinking. After a few seconds, maybe 10 seconds, I asked him to leave our house, but he just stood there mumbling something that I couldn't understand. His words were slurred, and his voice was filled with aggression. I didn't know what he was saying, but what really scared me was that he seemed angry. Ben was still in the living room. I turned around and saw him coming towards us, but I told him to stay back. I positioned myself in the doorway between Daryl and my brother, determined to keep him away from him. The tension escalated as Daryl continued to advance, his unsteady steps threatening to barge past me. I was no match for his strength. It wasn't even close. He took a final step towards me, about to get into the living room. In a last-ditch effort to protect my brother, I let out an ear-piercing scream, hoping that someone would come to our rescue. It was a long shot, but what else could I do? The sound of my voice seemed to momentarily startle Daryl, causing him to pause. Just then, I heard the garage door open, and the sound of heavy footsteps resonated through the house. Our father had arrived. I knew the sound of his footsteps. He walked into the room, his face red as a tomato. Without hesitation, he instructed Ben and me to go upstairs. We were more than happy to do that. I took Ben by the hand and led him to his room. We waited there listening. We tried to catch any indication of what was happening downstairs. All we could hear was some muffled talking and a heavy creaking of the door. I cautiously walked down the stairs. I was pretty sure Daryl was gone. My dad stood there in the front foyer, breathing heavily, and then he turned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded and then started crying. I didn't know what happened. I didn't know if I did something wrong or if I was in trouble. I just didn't know. We talked about it for a while, and when my mom came home, my dad filled her in. I'm not exactly sure what happened after that, but I think my parents called the police. All I know is that we never saw Daryl again. A nurse moved into Sarah's home soon after, taking on Daryl's role. Rumors went around the neighborhood about what happened. None of them were accurate. One of my friends told me that Daryl was arrested for robbing a bank. Way off. I knew the truth, but for some reason, I never wanted to tell anyone what really happened. This story took place in around 2016. My friends Gina, Sabrina, and I were all around the age of 17 and 18. During the early evening, we were riding my golf cart around the neighborhood. I was driving, Gina was riding up front, and Sabrina was in the back seat. We were driving straight, going up a hill, about to pass a car approaching a stop sign on the street to our left. The car proceeded to almost run through the stop sign and make a left-hand turn, but then they saw us and slammed on the brakes. As we passed them, they got behind us and started to follow us, screaming at us from out the window. They were angry because they claimed they couldn't see us, but it was still bright enough outside that the headlights weren't needed. As they were following us, they were yelling obscene things. I panicked and started turning down random streets trying to get away from them. I got to a new section of the neighborhood that was in the process of being built. I tried to cut through some woods that would come out in front of my parents' friend's house. When I took a right-hand turn to try to get into the woods, I ended up driving the golf cart onto a huge rock pile, causing it to nearly flip. The couple caught up to us, and a middle-aged man and woman got out of the car. The man started filming my friends and I. As I mentioned before, 2 out of the 3 of us were 17, so we were minors. We told him to stop filming us, while his wife called the police. I called my dad and he came to where we were. He helped us get the golf cart off the rock pile, while this crazy couple continued recording and screaming at us. We got the golf cart unstuck. My friends and I jumped back on and headed home. My dad decided to stay there and wait for the police. Gina was driving because she was the oldest of us. I got on the back. The crazy couple saw us leaving and got back into their car. They started following us so close that they almost rear-ended us. I was on the back of the golf cart screaming. They stopped and we made it home. We met up with my mom, who then went to the scene to help my dad. That way they would not be left alone with these crazy people. The police got there, and my parents explained the whole story from what we told them. The police sided with us, and they even told my parents how psychotic that couple was. Eventually the couple moved out of that neighborhood, and we never saw them again. Side note, during all this, they had their 2 young grandkids in the car, watching everything. Between the ages of 4 and 12, I was friends with a boy named Jack. Jack was always a bit of a strange kid, but being my neighbor, he was my first friend in life. Jack and I used to play every day, whether it was football, going to the park, or even playing tag in the street with the other kids in our neighborhood. You name it, we did it. One weekend in the summer, when we were 8 years old, it was a scorching hot day, and 2 of the kids in our street were having a water fight. Having some water guns in our shed, I thought it would be a great idea to fill one up and join in. As the day went on, we were having a great time. A few other kids had joined in with their water guns. That was when Jack came out with one of those insulated flasks that keeps your drink warm all day. He hurled the flask at us. Presumably, he intended to throw the water, but it was full to the brim, and it proved too heavy for him to keep a hold of. The water and flask fell to the pavement. Steam instantly rised, just a few feet from me and one of the other kids. Jack's mom came rushing out of her house and screamed at Jack to get inside. Being only 8, I didn't realize how serious this was. A couple years later, Jack and I went to a local park. When we got to the park, Jack asked me if I wanted to see something cool. He then pulled out a BB gun, a good one at that. Jack said that he got it off of his dad, who said he could shoot cans with it. But when Jack and I went into the forest behind the park, Jack then started firing at random kids who were also playing in the forest. I told him to stop a few times, but he told me to stop being boring and continue with his stupid behavior. I then made my way home, where Jack would follow, shooting me every so often. He hit me in the shins a few times. I told Jack to grow up, and then I told him I didn't want to hang out with him anymore, in school or after school. I continued to see Jack at school, though. He would smile creepily at me and make slices across his throat with his fingers when he saw me. One day, I was in my garden with my cousin, and Jack was in his bedroom. I could see him through the window. He had a tie on, and made a noose gesture with it, and then pointed at me and my cousin, before smiling sinisterly. Jack became very odd, and with our houses being attached, I would hear him hysterically laughing at night, and I would hear bangs on the wall at stupid hours of the night. Shortly after I turned 11, Jack and his family moved away, and life was peaceful. I continued to grow up, and lived out my mid-late teens with great friends. Jack did become a distant memory as I lived out my teens, and moved away to university. I'm now 22, and when I visited my home this past summer, my parents informed me that Jack had been admitted into a mental institution after he attempted to kill his parents. He had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. This shocked me, and I didn't quite know what to say, but these events did come flashing back to me when I found out what he did. My dad actually told me that the water fight incident was serious. Jack had attempted to throw boiling hot water at me and my friends that day, and we could have been seriously scalded. So Jack, I hope you're getting the help you need in the institution. I have this neighbor who lives across the street from me. He doesn't live alone. He lives with his parents. For privacy reasons, let's call him Drew. My parents tell me that Drew has issues, and when he's acting crazy, to stay away from him. I had a conversation with him, and he seemed normal when he was on his medication. One time, Drew stabbed his grandfather to death when he was young. He was arrested at first, until his family told them that he had mental issues. The judge ordered Drew to be evaluated at a mental hospital until he was no longer a threat to himself and others. He moved back to his parents' house after that. I forgot to mention that when he was off his medication, he would start to yell or sing at random times. Another time, when I was 14 years old in my room, I heard yelling from across the street, and I looked out my window. It was him. The windows from my room showed his house, so I could see everything. He had a knife and was yelling gibberish to drivers, trying to break in. Drew targeted people who drove on the road. Drivers swerved to get out of the way and drove fast down the road. They were scared. I was frozen in fear and didn't do anything about it except watch it go down. One driver contacted 911. Drew ran inside the house when he heard sirens. He locked himself inside and refused to let anyone in. Police and the SWAT team told me to stay indoors until it was peaceful. The crazy neighbor stayed in his house for 8 hours until he gave himself up to the authorities. He was taken again to the mental hospital and again released back to his parents' house. The mother moved out because she was afraid of him. She found his writing about him wanting to kill her. She divorced her husband after he refused to get him into a mental hospital. He didn't find any writing about him, so that's why. The last time something happened was last year. Drew broke into his next-door neighbor's house, and he waited for them to come home. He had a machete with him. My mother saw him breaking into the house from the window and called the police. He was taken away. His father told my parents that he would be in the mental hospital for life. When my parents asked why, he refused to tell them. My now ex-husband Dave and I were thrilled when we moved into our first home. It was a condo in a new building on the 18th floor. Little did we know that a horrible experience was about to begin. Our neighbor Nick had an eerie vibe about him from the moment we met. His cold gaze seemed to linger for too long. We tried our best to ignore it at first. I can be pretty socially awkward myself, so I get it. We still couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off, though. Nick lived a floor above us and one unit over. We could see him sometimes when we were on our balcony. He would be right above us. We lived there for about 6 months with no real incidents, just some awkward moments in the halls. We often caught glimpses of Nick watching us from his balcony, but nothing too bad. We became increasingly cautious, drawing the blinds and closing our curtains. Dave thought I was being too paranoid, and I thought he had a point at the time. One evening I returned home from work. Dave wasn't home yet. I opened the door and walked in. When I looked down at the floor, there was an envelope slipped under the door. I cautiously picked it up, not thinking much of it at first. It could have been some kind of work notice from the building, although they didn't usually do things like that. I ripped the envelope open. There were several printed photographs. As I examined them, dread washed over me like a tidal wave. The pictures showed Dave and me sound asleep in our bedroom. Intimate moments captured without our knowledge or consent. My hands trembled and a knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The images were full-page size, black and white photographs that seemed to be printed by a computer from the 90s. They weren't great quality, but it was definitely us. Whoever took them was in our room when we were sleeping. Our suspicions turned immediately to Nick, the neighbor who had always weirded us out. He seemed to be the most likely culprit, but without any evidence, we were left feeling vulnerable and powerless. Dave thinks he climbed down from our balcony, Spider-Man style, to break in. I know it sounds far-fetched, but I don't have a better answer. There's no way that somebody came in from the street. We reported it to the building and the police, but everyone was pretty useless. There should have been some way to check who slipped the envelope under the door. There were security cameras in the halls, but building security said they couldn't find anything. I think it was just laziness on their part, but maybe there was some technical issue as well. We installed security cameras and started locking our balcony door, but the feeling of being watched constantly haunted us day and night. We couldn't shake the paranoia that gnawed at our sanity, never knowing when or where the next invasion would happen. We hardly slept for months. As the weeks went on, our relationship strained under the weight of what was happening. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or some other issues that I won't get into, but Dave and I separated around that time. He stayed in the condo, and I moved into an apartment. To this day, the true identity of the invader remains a mystery, an unsolved chapter in our lives. I carry the weight of that experience, forever changed by that invasion of my privacy. It was a dark time, and this may be the last time that I ever discuss it. When I was 16, I lived in a quiet cul-de-sac in Northern California. All the neighbors knew each other, and we all got along great. We would often have cookouts together, and we would go swimming at each other's pools, etc. It was a really safe area, and the whole neighborhood was familiar. There was one man, however, who always struck me as a little odd. He lived by himself, tucked away in a house where he raised chickens, and didn't really seem to work. This man, we'll call him Mark, was good friends with my immediate neighbor. He was probably in his late 60s at the time. He wasn't much taller than me. He had a wild gray beard and unkempt gray hair. We were used to seeing him around and having him join in on our festivities. It also wasn't unusual for my mom to send us up the road to buy eggs from him, just when we'd run short and she didn't want to run to the store. Par for the course for our neighborhood. On the 4th of July, we had a big barbecue and invited everyone. Mark joined us, and everyone was enjoying the night. It was warm, the adults were drinking, the kids were playing, and it was just overall a great time. But the whole night, Mark kept trying to talk to me. I would always find him at my hip, trying to draw my attention away from my friends and chat. At one point, he said,
I would sure love to just go up into the mountains, far away from everyone, and just bring a woman with me, you know?
Then he said,
Everyone sucks but you, baby.
And when he said baby, he gestured towards me. I kind of laughed and tried to shrug it off and carry on with the night. I was 16 years old at the time, and still beholden to the be polite no matter the cost mindset, and didn't address it the way I should have. Eventually, everyone packed up and started heading to their houses. I somehow ended up alone outside with Mark. I was getting something out of my car, and he came up close to me. I was essentially pinned against the car. I don't really remember what he was talking to me about, but I was uncomfortable. I just wanted to go inside. I have to go to work in the morning, so I should probably head inside and go to bed, I said, when there was a pause in the conversation.
Oh no, come on, let's just sit and talk for a little while longer.
I really can't. I have to be going. I have to work tomorrow. But he kept insisting, telling me he just wanted to talk and that he was lonely. At this point, he was closer, and I could smell the beer and barbecue on his breath. I glanced over my shoulder, hoping someone would come outside and I could use them as a distraction or an excuse to leave, but no one was there. The porch light wasn't even on. My parents and siblings were watching TV at the back of the house. Look, I said, while trying not to sound as panicked as I was starting to feel. I honestly just need to go to bed. I can't stand talk. I'm sorry.
Well, alright then. Can I at least get a hug?
I hesitated. I didn't want to give him a hug, but I had been raised in an environment where hugging was normal, encouraged, and expected, so I agreed. I was thinking that if I at least gave him a hug, then he would be placated and let me leave. He pulled me in close and pulled my hips in. I was so stunned that I just stood there. He started kissing my neck and telling me how badly he wanted me, that he wanted to just run away with me and never come back. That was enough for me to push him away and run inside. I could still smell his breath, and the feel of his beard against my neck. I was so scared and so disgusted. This man was 50 years older than me, and had just put his hands all over me. My mom could tell immediately that something was wrong, so I told her everything. She called the police right away, and they came over and talked to him. He denied ever touching me at all. He said I was lying for attention. Nevertheless, they told me to stay away from him. The entire neighborhood ousted Mark. No one would speak to him anymore or invite him to anything. Even my next-door neighbor wouldn't include him anymore. I know it's not the scariest encounter, and I'm lucky that everyone believed me and took immediate action on my behalf. I know that it could have been far worse, but I was absolutely terrified. Not many young women are surrounded by such support, and my neighbors showed me that they were truly good people. We ended up moving away a few years later, but I remained good friends with Mark's next-door neighbor and still go to visit her sometimes, 13 or so years later. I'm always worried that I'll see him again, but I never have, and I'm grateful for that. This occurred 3 years ago, when I was in the 6th grade. Summer break just started, and me and my friends were looking to do some ding-dong ditching. We went months earlier during the school year, but that resulted in us getting suspended, and the police were notified. We were desperate to start again, so it wasn't a surprise when my friends contacted me to have a ding-dong ditching session while wearing our Halloween masks. It was the last day of school, and I was up for it because we couldn't get suspended now. We all met up after school with our Spider-Man masks and other weird things we could use to hide our faces. We started instantly. My friend Jose took the first house. He ran up, ignoring the no trespassing sign. He kicked the door, and we all sprinted away laughing. To our dismay, nobody opened the door. Jordan took the second house. He ran up and punched the screen, a loud noise. We ran away laughing again. However, this time a skinny man, around 30 years old, opened the door. He saw us running away and was extremely angry. After seconds of shouting, he slammed the door and went back inside. I chuckled and said we should do his house again, expecting a big reaction. I wanted to look brave, so I ran up, kicked the screen, and ran away. This time, it was as if he was waiting right behind the door. When I was around 10 feet away, it swung open, and the man darted after me. He quickly realized that he couldn't catch a skinny, fast 12-year-old kid, so he jumped into his car and started it. My friends and I were screaming in fear, realizing this crazy man was going to chase us in his car. I was the fastest out of the group, so I had the lead. We all ran down the hill, where 2 of my friends lived. They ran into their houses, leaving 4 of us to keep sprinting, being chased by a lunatic man in a car. I kept running, even though my lungs felt like they were about to burst. I turned a corner and jumped a fence into a random backyard. The rest of my friends joined me. Jordan thought about calling the police, but we talked him out of it, because we would get in trouble for ding-dong ditching anyway. We watched the guy speed past our hiding spot as we breathed sighs of relief. Suddenly he parked his car, as if he was going to be looking around for us, but we hid well, and he hadn't spotted us in the bushes. We could see him talking to some kids who were trying to walk home. After taking one last look around, he eventually drove away in his rusty, beat-up old Honda. Jordan had to walk the path that the man had drove away, so he waited a bit and ran for it. 5 seconds after he ran out, he turned around and screamed. He took a U-turn. The man was parked behind a house waiting to see if we would come out, and Jordan fell for it. He screamed and ran away at full sprint, and the man chased him in his car. I thought I was going to die. As if summoned by God, we noticed a police car parked 50 feet away in front of us. We bolted towards it, shouting for help. The man floored it after he saw the car. We told the cop a fake story about how the man was chasing us in his car, and we were trying to walk home. Sadly, none of us thought to get the license plate. This is something that happened to me and my wife Jillian at our apartment. After this incident, we moved out of that place and never looked back. It was a one-bedroom above a retail store in the old part of our town. It was an old building, and it had thin walls and a lot of quirks. The pipes were noisy, and we shared hot water with the neighbor, so if he took a shower, then we might not have hot water. It was cheap though, and it was all we could afford at the time. We had gotten married right out of college, and my wife had not found work yet. The way the building was laid out was that there was a single entrance at the back alley. The stairs up to our apartment were shared with our neighbor, and it was just the two apartments that used it. Our neighbor Alan was an older guy, probably 50 years old. He seemed decent most of the time when we saw him, but he had some issues. He was definitely a drinker, and we thought he was into some harder drugs as well. When sober, Alan was a really quiet and soft-spoken person. However, late at night, we would hear some disturbing things coming from his place. Whether it was crashing noises or yelling, it was like there was always something going on over there. We were worried most of the time when that happened. Because of that, we tried to keep our distance from Alan. Whenever we saw him during the day, he would be very apologetic about whatever commotion happened the night before. It kept happening though, and we got sick of listening to his excuses. We were laying awake one night, and there were people yelling next door. Alan lived alone, but there were always people over there. If I had to guess, there were probably at least 3 other people with Alan. We suspected that he was either buying or selling drugs to them. That's because the conversation didn't seem friendly. We could usually hear what they were saying, and that gave it away for the most part. Suddenly, I heard the downstairs door open. Someone started stomping up the stairs. I got out of bed and walked to the door. I peered through the peephole and saw a man walking up the stairs. This guy was tall and thin, with a bald head and a tattoo on his face. He seemed like the kind of guy who you would avoid on the street. I didn't want to judge, but I couldn't help it. The man walked past our door and burst into Alan's apartment. I walked back to my bedroom and told Jillian what I saw. We still thought it was just another night of Alan's antics, but as soon as the other man walked in, they went silent. Then we heard a shrill scream out of nowhere. That was followed by a loud gurgling noise. I don't know how else to describe it. Then went silent again. If we listened closely, we could hear some whispers. We couldn't tell exactly what they were saying at that point. Next, we heard Alan's door open. Jillian stayed in our bedroom, but I was curious, so I tiptoed over to the door again and looked out the peephole. I saw 2 men. Neither of them were Alan, and they were carrying a third man down the stairs. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Had they killed that man? I had no idea. I walked back to the bedroom. I was still shaking uncontrollably. When I told Jillian what happened, she said that we should call the police. I didn't want to at first, but then we heard Alan's door open again. He stomped up to our door and then started pounding on it. That was when we realized that he probably heard the word police coming from us. He pounded on the door for a few seconds, and then it started to seem like he was trying to break in. I looked over to Jillian, and she already had her phone out to call the police. There was no discussion now. I knew she needed to call. Luckily, our door held for long enough. The police got there and arrested Alan. He spent the night in jail for what he did to us, but we also told them about what we saw and heard leading up to that. I did my best to describe the man, but it didn't match anybody who had been reported missing, so they had to let him go. Before they could do that, we packed up what we could and moved in with my sister until we could find another place. That night will always give me nightmares. I really think they killed that guy in that place while we were laying in bed listening. We were scared for a long time that Alan or one of his friends would come after us for snitching, but they didn't. We never saw him again, and this happened over 10 years ago. I grew up in a suburb, a few miles outside of a small town. It was home to mostly elderly couples, so my twin sister and I only had each other to play with. When we first moved into the neighborhood, it was summer, and we spent most of our days outside. None of our neighbors paid us much mind, except for one man who lived a few houses down. The most distinct features I remember about him were that he had gray hair and a well-trimmed beard. He started off by just smiling and waving as he drove by in his black truck. We were very shy children, so it took us a long time to even acknowledge him back. He just seemed friendly after a while. One thing that I should mention is that my parents had us very young, so they did what they thought was best at the time. My mom was a night shift nurse, and my dad worked a job that I can no longer recall. My mom would stay home with us during the day and catch up on sleep. Then my father would take his turn at night. As I mentioned before, we spent most of our time in our front yard, and we were rarely supervised. The man drove by our house several times a day, but we never thought much of it. The waves and smiles then turned to him slowing down to say hello. Then he began to ask us what games we were playing. He took more interest in what we were doing. At some point along the way, he started calling us his girlfriends. We just thought it was a silly joke between the three of us, and we never gave it much thought. On our first birthday at the new house, our dad got us a puppy. She was a collie mix, and we named her Rosie. We never left her out of our sight when we were outside. She always wanted to do what we were doing. The neighbor asked us if she was a birthday present, to which we replied yes. He made the comment of how cute the three of us were, running around in the yard. Again, I thought nothing of it, and just went back to playing. Unfortunately, Rosie didn't live very long. She developed a habit of chasing cars shortly after we got her. That was the only time that she would leave our side. One morning, about 2 months after we got her, we were waiting in our driveway for the mailman, and when he pulled away, Rosie went. That was the last time, and it happened right in front of us. My sister was so shocked she couldn't move. I had to be the one to tell Mom. That evening when Dad got home, we buried her under a tree beside our house. A few days after that, our neighbor asked where Rosie was. Our neighbor asked what happened to Rosie, and I remember crying as we told him. This was the only time he got out of his truck when we talked to him. He hugged us, said he was sorry about what happened to our dog, and then got back into his truck. He came back a few minutes later with about 10 pictures in his hand. They were all of my sister and I playing with Rosie in our front yard. He told us he thought she was a pretty dog. He said that we could keep the pictures, and then drove off. My sister took them inside and put them in her shoebox of memorabilia, where they sat forgotten for several years. We were probably juniors in high school when my sister opened that shoebox again. She decided to pin the pictures of us and Rosie on her corkboard, since they were fond childhood memories. She's a very sentimental person. We called our mom in to show her what we had found. She asked us where we got the pictures from. We told her they were from the neighbor who lived down the street from us. He had moved a couple years before, but we explained to her that he gave us the pictures of Rosie after she was run over. Realization started creeping in, and I could see it on my sister's face too. He never talked to y'all, did he? My mom's voice rose with concern. He talked to us almost every day. He even called us his girlfriends, and would sometimes ask if we wanted to play in his yard. We were all silent after that. Nothing even happened to us, and we couldn't even remember the guy's name to do a Google search on him, but we all felt the weight of what could have happened. Another question was, since he took those pictures of us with our dog, did that mean that he had more pictures that he didn't give us? Fortunately, we never went with him. We never left the yard, and we would never leave with anyone we didn't know, no matter how friendly they were. So to the neighbor from my childhood, I'm not your girlfriend. I share an apartment with my roommate. We'll call her Sarah. Our place was cozy, and we had developed a comfortable routine. I was 31 at the time. Most people get their own place by then, but I liked living with someone else. It made me feel more safe. We'd known each other since college, and our personalities clicked perfectly. It was a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent building. We had settled into our daily lives, immersed in work, occasional outings, and the comfort of each other's company. One night, however, would change the way we felt about the safety of our home forever. I remember it as if it were yesterday, even though it was over 5 years ago. It was a typical Thursday evening, when Sarah and I decided to catch up on our favorite TV shows. We settled onto the couch with some snacks. We talked about our days and shared some silly gossip. It was a relaxing evening, and we were both looking forward to a quiet night's sleep. As the clock struck midnight, we finally decided to call it a night. I headed to my room, while Sara headed to hers. I changed into my comfortable clothes and went to bed. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was Sara, probably grabbing a glass of water or something. However, the footsteps didn't stop at her room. They continued towards my bedroom. Confusion mingled with fear as I sat up, straining to listen. The door to my room creaked open slowly, and my heart raced. Before I could react, Sarah's voice broke the silence. "There's someone in the house," she whispered, her voice trembling. I sprang out of bed and turned my gaze towards the doorway. There he was, a man standing in the hallway. He was tall, with a disheveled appearance. I recognized him. I had seen him around the building. He was one of our neighbors. My breath caught in my throat as I struggled to process what was happening. Just then, I slammed my door and blocked it with my body. Then I heard footsteps again. He was coming for me. He started banging on my door and trying to open it. I screamed for Sara to call the police. Then I heard her yell for the man to leave, because the police were on their way. The banging continued for another 10 seconds, and then it stopped. I heard the man leave at that moment. When the police finally arrived, we told them everything. We told them that he was one of our neighbors, but we weren't sure which apartment was his. With the description we gave them, they were able to track him down and arrest him. We never found out what he wanted, but I think it's fair to say that the guy was not right in the head. There are 2 lessons I learned from this experience. One is to never live alone, and the other is to always lock your damn doors. I lived in my old apartment for about 5 years. In the time that I stayed there, the apartment next to me saw a lot of different people. I never really got to know any of them, but this story is about one neighbor who I'll never forget. My place was a small bachelor in one of the cheaper buildings in my area. It was on the 9th floor, with a pretty nice view of the city. My place was at the end of the hallway, so I only had a neighbor on one side. At the other end of the hallway was the garbage chute. It smelled a little, but the stink never made it to my end of the hall. There were 2 stairwells on the floor. One was next to the garbage chute, and the other was right across from my door. That staircase got very little use, since most people use the elevator anyway. Another thing that I'll mention is that the walls in the building were really thick. I don't think I ever heard a single noise from my neighbor. In fact, one time my next door neighbor moved out and another moved in, without me even noticing. Therefore, I genuinely didn't know if my neighbor was there or not. I imagine the same was true for them. One day, I was in the elevator with someone who I had never seen before. He was a guy around my age. I was 26. He hit the button for the 9th floor. When I noticed that, I introduced myself. He said his name was Darren, and he seemed like a nice guy. He was wearing gym clothes, and he seemed to be in really good shape. It made me think that I should join the gym. After that, I didn't see Darren again for a while. We both kept to ourselves, but saw each other in passing from time to time. One day, I walked out of my apartment into the hall, and a smell hit me. It was a really terrible smell, like rotting garbage. I thought it was coming from the garbage chute on the other end of the hall, but when I walked over there, the smell faded. It wasn't coming from there. One of my neighbors must have left some garbage for too long, I thought. As the days went on, it got worse and worse. Eventually, it became unbearable. I didn't know where it was coming from, and I couldn't understand how my neighbor didn't notice it. If it was coming from his place, then there'd be no way that he could bear it. It was that bad. I was about to tell the building superintendent, but on a whim, I decided to check the stairwell across from my door. As soon as I opened it, I saw a body lying face down. I quickly shut the door and ran into my apartment and locked it. I thought there was a murderer on the loose. I quickly called 911. The police came moments later, and I was relieved to see them. They took the body away, and I talked to one of the officers. The deceased was identified as my next-door neighbor Darren. That would explain why he didn't notice the smell. I thought at that point that he was murdered, but that wasn't true. It turned out that Darren had been running up and down the stairs for exercise. The police determined that he simply lost his balance and fell, hitting his head on the concrete stairs, killing him. He laid there dead for days, waiting to be found. The whole time, I was feet away from that poor guy, a victim of a freak accident. It shook our building pretty hard. Our management added cameras into the staircase. I don't personally see how that would help, but I think they felt like they needed to do something. In my opinion, it was a tragic accident, and I'm not sure if there's any way to prevent things like that from happening. He was just trying to get some exercise, and ended up dead. I still think about him, often. I moved to a new city last year for work. I was able to afford a pretty nice place in a good neighborhood that was not too far outside the city. I was alone at the time, but I was hoping to be able to settle down eventually, and if that were to happen, then this place would be perfect. The house was 2 stories with 3 bedrooms, and a really nice open space on the main floor that was the living room, dining room, and kitchen. It had a great open feel. The backyard was also pretty big compared to anywhere else I had lived. This was my first real home, and it was a big step for me. Since I lived alone at the time, I asked my brother to help me move in. I rented a van, and my brother drove, because he's much better behind the wheel than I am. I didn't have much stuff, because I was coming from an apartment. The house was going to be pretty empty at first. When we pulled up to my new place, we unloaded everything quickly, and then my brother took off. I spent the rest of the evening getting some things set up. The internet guy came later in the day, and after that, I set up my computer. Then I screwed around on YouTube for a few hours before going to bed. For some reason, I couldn't really sleep the first night. I often have trouble sleeping in unfamiliar places, so I was expecting this. My bedroom faced the street at the front of the house. There was a street light nearby, so some of the light spilled into my room from outside. It was a little annoying, and I thought I would have to get some thick curtains to block it out. Suddenly, I saw a shadow move across the light from my window. Out of curiosity, I peeked out. There was a man walking down the sidewalk in front of my house. I could see that he was looking towards my front window, but I didn't know if he saw me. The man was a normal-looking guy. He wore a dark blue jacket and jeans, and wore thick-framed glasses. He was probably 50 years old, give or take. That was strange, because it was the middle of the night, 2 a.m. For this neighborhood, that was really weird, because there was no nightlife to speak of. I don't think anything was open nearby. That being said, I was new to the area, so maybe there was something I was missing. I kept watching him for a while, because I couldn't sleep anyway. Eventually, I saw the man walk across the street and go into one of the houses. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking he was just my neighbor out for a late-night walk. Maybe he couldn't sleep either. I can relate to that. A few days went by, and I met most of my neighbors, but not the one across the street who I saw that night. He seemed like a bit of an outcast in the area. I tried to introduce myself to him once when he was out on his porch, but he straight up ignored me. I try to be understanding, because there's nothing wrong with keeping to yourself, but this guy gave off a really bad impression. Fast forward to next week. After work, I went out with some of my coworkers, and we had dinner at a local spot. When I got home, I saw that neighbor of mine sitting on his porch, just looking towards my place. That was becoming a common occurrence. When I got into my house, something seemed off. Felt like somebody had been in there. It was just a feeling at first. I walked around my house for a few minutes, trying to find something to confirm my suspicion. Eventually, I noticed a faint set of footsteps that I knew weren't mine. I never leave my shoes on in the house, but I could see clear footprints on the floor. I was planning to get some security cameras the next day. That way if anything happened again, then I could get some proof to show the cops. For that night though, I just walked around the whole house, making sure the doors and windows were locked. After I was sure everything was good, I went to the bathroom to take a shower. It was around 11 p.m. by then. When I got out, I looked out my bedroom window and saw my neighbor across the street. He was just sitting in his window, looking at my house, it seemed. I closed the curtains quickly, hoping he didn't see me. As the night went on, I couldn't sleep again. It was 3 a.m. and I was still wide awake. There was still some light coming into my room from outside, even though I had bought some good curtains. Like before, I saw a shadow break the beams of light. I peeked out my window again, and I saw my neighbor walking towards my house. I watched as he got closer and closer, eventually disappearing from my view. That man was right next to my house, and I could hear his footsteps on my porch, which was hidden from my view. I had no idea what that guy was up to, and I didn't know if I should hide or go downstairs to scare him off. Too curious to resist, I tiptoed down the stairs, and when I was about halfway down, I started to hear a scraping sound from my front door. At that moment, I pulled out my phone and called the police. There was no doubt that he was breaking in. I talked to the operator for less than a minute before the cops were on their way. I continued down the stairs with 911 on the line. At the moment that my foot touched the main floor, I heard my door swing open. I looked around the corner to the front door. My neighbor was standing in the doorway of my house with a blank look on his face. We locked eyes for the longest 5 seconds of my life. The man's expression was truly chilling. It was like he was waiting in line for a coffee, like he did this every day. I, on the other hand, was shaking and probably crying a little. I couldn't force a word out. Instead, I ran back up the stairs and into my room. I gave the operator an update, and he assured me that the police were close. Less than a minute later, I saw police cars approaching. When they got there, the man was still on my porch, and my front door was still wide open. When they took him into custody, they found a set of lock-picking tools that he must have used to get into my house. I looked it up online, and apparently, it's not that hard to pick into most door locks. Most people can figure it out with some practice. I didn't know that until this happened. My neighbor was taken away that night. Unfortunately, I never saw him again. It turned out that the house was owned by his mother, and after he got out of jail, he was not allowed to return. To this day, I don't know how many times he broke in, or if he had come in while I was sleeping. I moved out into the country a few years ago. It was a rural area that had been mostly farms, but there were plans to develop it further in the future. That's one of the reasons I moved out there. Not only was it a pretty nice place, but if it became more developed, then my property value could go way up. For the time being, though, it was surrounded by farm fields, and my nearest neighbor was about 100 yards down the road. I had about 10 acres, and my property backed onto my neighbor's. Neither of us was doing much with the land, though. Mine was just a barren field, likely depleted from years of neglect. My neighbor's was similar. When I first moved in, I introduced myself to that neighbor. His name was Dan, and he was a single guy in his mid-50s. Dan was retired, but he used to own a truck rental business, and they still used his property to store some of the trucks. There was a large building near his house where they were stored. Because of that, there would occasionally be some people coming and going from there. I didn't mind, because it wasn't much noise. That, and Dan was a really nice guy, so I was happy to tolerate it. I was coming home one night late when I passed Dan's house. There was a car parked on the road in front of it. It wasn't that unusual for people to visit, but it was around 1 a.m., so I thought that was strange. It was really none of my business, though, so I obviously didn't do anything. I went right to bed when I got home, and didn't give it a second thought. The next morning when I drove by Dan's house, the car was gone. I went to work that day, and when I got home later, there was a man who I had never seen before on Dan's property. Assuming it was just one of the employees from his old company, I ignored it. I would recognize most of those guys, though, but people come and go, so I assumed it was just that. I went to bed that night at around 11 p.m., but couldn't sleep. By 1 a.m., I decided to go for a walk around my property in order to tire myself out. Stepping onto my porch, I could barely see anything. The moon was not very bright, so I took out my phone to use as a light. After 5 or 10 minutes, my eyes had adjusted, and I was able to see without the light, so I put my phone away. Since I knew that my land was basically flat, I didn't need much light in order to walk around. When I got to the edge of my property where it met Dan's, I looked over and saw 2 lights in the distance. They were near Dan's house, probably close to his driveway. I was pretty sure that there were 2 people out there, but I had no idea what they were doing. Although I was confused, I went back to my house. So far, nothing was that suspicious, but the pieces eventually came together. Over the following days, I didn't see Dan, not even once. I would usually see him doing yard work or going for a walk around his land, but he was nowhere to be found. After about a week, I grew concerned. One evening after work, I walked over to his house to ring the doorbell. Standing on his porch, I could see into his garage through a window, and his truck was there. That should have meant that he was home. However, nobody answered the door. I tried 2 more times. All in all, I probably stood in front of that door for almost 20 minutes, just hoping he would answer. After I gave up, I walked back to my house and contemplated what to do. In the end, there was really no other choice. I had to call the police and possibly report him as a missing person. Initially, I just asked for a simple wellness check on my neighbor. I didn't bother with the other details at first. The cops were there in no time. I could see the cars from my house. Tension built in my body as the minutes ticked past. I was genuinely terrified of what they might find. After they spent some time at Dan's place, 2 officers came to my door. That's when I found out that something terrible may have happened. When the police were outside of Dan's house, they found signs of a break-in. Upon entering the place, more concerning things were discovered. There was a broken window leading to the kitchen, and there was a plate on his table with rotting food, as if he disappeared in the middle of a meal. Most concerning, however, was that they found a trail of blood on the floor, leading to the back door. Dan was reported missing right then. That was when I told the cops everything I knew. What seemed like some strange but benign things now looked like crucial evidence. I did my best to describe the car that I saw on the street, and told them about the 2 lights on his property in the middle of the night. I'm not sure exactly how they did it, but the police eventually made an arrest. The suspects were 2 of Dan's former employees. One of them was currently running the company. After the 2 were in custody, I heard that a body was found a few miles from my house. I never got to know Dan very well, but he seemed like a really good guy. The sight of his house still gives me chills whenever I see it. This is a terrifying story that happened to me a few years ago, not long after I moved into my old apartment. I still live in the same city, and every time I pass that place, I get chills. I was 25 at the time, and I had been out on my own for a while. The apartment was a small, quiet place on the 4th floor. The building had 5 floors total, and the floors were hard wood that had warped with time. They were uneven, and they creaked in almost every spot. Believe it or not, this was a pretty big step up for me, because I used to live in a shared house, where I was sharing a bedroom with a guy who I barely knew. I also crashed on friends' couches for a while as well. Having my own place of any kind was a real luxury at the time. When I first moved in, the halls seemed empty. I didn't see any sign of other people, but it was a weekday afternoon, so maybe they were at work. Once I got my stuff set up, I crashed on the floor in the living room. I had bought an air mattress at Walmart because I didn't have a bed yet. Suddenly, I was awoken by a strong knock on my door. I rolled over and looked at my phone. It was 5 in the morning. Although annoyed, I thought it could be something important, maybe the landlord, so I got up and looked out the peephole. It was a man in his 40s, standing in front of my door, stone-faced. I thought it might be the superintendent, or someone who worked for the building, so I answered it. The guy told me that he was my next-door neighbor, and introduced himself as Jared. I tried to be polite, but really I was annoyed that he woke me up so early in the morning. I wasn't sure what he was thinking. I tried to end the conversation, but he had a way of lingering too long. He asked me a few mundane questions like where I work, and I think he even mentioned the weather at one point. Eventually, I gathered the courage to end it. I said goodbye and closed the door while he was still mid-sentence. After he was gone, I went back to my air mattress and got another few hours of sleep before getting up. The following day, I did some errands and went out for lunch with a friend. When I came back to the building, it was 5 p.m. I walked up the stairs to the 4th floor, and when I entered the hall, that neighbor of mine was standing right in front of my door. I was taken aback, but tried to pretend it was nothing. When he saw me from across the hall, he turned around and went back to his apartment. At that point, the man was really creeping me out. This incident was even worse than the other. I was uncomfortable for the rest of the night, but I managed to get a decent sleep. Over the next week, I met some of my other neighbors. One of them was a guy named Sam, who was around my age, and he'd been in the building for around a year. I asked him about Jared, and Sam told me that he was a little strange, but harmless. After that, I felt a little better about it. Maybe I was overreacting. By then, I had finished setting up my place, and I had a queen-size bed. I also bought a couch and a table. The place was finally looking like home. One night that week, I went to bed at around midnight. At some point in the night, I awoke to a stiff knock at my front door. I checked the time, and it was 3:15 a.m. My mind went straight to Jared. Who else could it be? I walked over to the door and looked out the peephole. Sure enough, he was standing right there in front of my door. "Hey man, it's not a good time," I said. I would have called the police, but after what Sam told me, I thought the guy might be a little off. Maybe he had social problems, and I should have some patience. Jared didn't say a word. He just stood there in front of my door, and he started knocking again. This time he didn't stop. I didn't know what to do. Maybe he would just stand out there all night knocking. I couldn't have that, but I also didn't want to get the cops involved. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, hoping I could talk some sense into him. As soon as I turned the knob, my door burst open. The edge caught me in the forehead, and I stumbled back. I regained my balance and managed to force Jared back out into the hallway, but my door was still open a little. His arm was stuck. That's when I noticed that there was a knife in his hand. He must have pulled it out as soon as I opened the door. After a few hard pushes on the door, he dropped the knife to the floor and pulled his arm out. As soon as it was closed, I called the police. Jared was taken out in handcuffs after the cops got there. After the incident, he was evicted from the building as well. I never saw him again. Even though he was gone, I never felt comfortable in that apartment again. I started looking for places right after this happened. Within a month, I found something else. My landlord was very understanding and let me break the lease. It was a huge relief when I finally got out of that place. In my early 20s, I moved to a new neighborhood. It was a quiet area not far outside of the city. My place was a small townhouse that was more than enough for me. The rent was affordable too, so I was happy to find it. It was just the main floor, with someone else's place up above. I had 2 bedrooms and an open space where the kitchen and living room were. There was just a single bathroom. It was just me though, so that was fine. The spare bedroom wasn't used for much. I was going to turn it into a guest room, but hadn't gotten around to it yet, so it was just a bare room at the time. There was a small closet on one end and a window on the other. I always kept that window closed and locked because I never used it. I had taken a job working nights at a local warehouse, which meant my sleep schedule was all over the place. Most days when I wasn't working, I found myself wide awake all night. There was no point in trying to sleep regular hours anyway, so I just embraced the nocturnal lifestyle. Since I was on strange hours, it made friendships tough to come by. I'm a pretty social person, but even after 4 months of living there, I still hadn't met most of my neighbors. My next door neighbors to the right were a young family who I only met once or twice. There was also a single guy a few years older than me, who I had never actually met. I had just seen him around once or twice. Other than that, the rest of them might as well have been strangers. One night, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through the TV channels. It was around 4 a.m., a time when pretty much everyone else would be asleep. Suddenly, I heard a creak. It was soft, but enough to make me curious. Like I said, I had a townhouse, so there would occasionally be noises from my neighbors. At this hour, though, it was rare. I decided to check it out, just to ease my mind, so I got up and walked through the house, but the sound didn't happen again. I checked the living room, the kitchen area, even the small bathroom. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to head back to the couch when I looked into the spare room. There was something off about the window. I walked over and stood in front of it. The window, which I normally kept locked, was broken. The glass wasn't shattered, but the latch was broken, and it was clearly not shut all the way. I took a closer look at it, and when I inspected the screen, I could see a small slit that I didn't think was there before. I hadn't opened that window, and no one else should have either. At that moment, I was pretty sure that somebody had broken in. I didn't know if they were still in the house or if they had left. I ran to my bedroom to make sure nothing was stolen. The only real valuable thing that I had was my MacBook Pro, but it was sitting on my bed where I had left it. Although somewhat relieved, I knew now that it wasn't a robbery. If someone was still in the house, and there's no telling how long they had been there. I only noticed a slight creak, but there's no way I would have missed someone cranking open that window. It surely would have made a more serious noise. Maybe it happened when I was out, and the person was in my house somewhere, waiting for hours. I wasn't about to take any chances. I grabbed my phone and quickly left the house, locking the door behind me. Not that that would help anything. While I was walking down the street, I called the police. I waited out there, wondering what the hell was going on. Part of me thought I was going crazy, maybe too much coffee and sleepless nights. The police arrived after a while, and they went inside to check the house. After a few tense minutes, I watched them come back out. They had found someone inside, one of my neighbors. He was the guy who I had seen around, but never really talked to. The police said he seemed disoriented and confused, and that they found him in my bedroom closet. I thought he was drunk or something. They took him into custody, and I was left to piece together what had happened. Sleep was hard to come by for the next few days. A while later, I learned from the police that my neighbor claimed he had gotten drunk and mistook my house for his own. He had broken the window when he couldn't get in through the locked door. I think that's nonsense. If he came in by accident, then why did he hide in the closet? If he thought it was his own place, then he would have walked right in. That guy must have been there for hours with me, and the only sign of him was a slight creak and a broken window. I later found out that everyone in my neighborhood thought the guy was a creep as well. The break-in was a scary experience. I stayed in that place for almost a year after this happened, and that guy was still around when I left. It was weird seeing him on the streets, but neither of us ever said a word to the other. I'm 31 years old now, but this happened when I was 12 or 13. My family and I lived in a house in a middle-class neighborhood. It had 2 stories with a finished basement, so there was a lot of space for me, my brother, and my sister. My sister was 2 years older, and my brother was 1 year younger. Many of our neighbors had kids too. It was that kind of neighborhood. My best friend was only a few houses down, and my brother's best friend was right next door. The family across the street was a little older, so we didn't know their kids very well. We'll call them the Pattersons. There was a boy and a girl. The boy, who we'll call Darren, was a year out of high school at the time, but still living at home. The girl, who we'll call Sam, was a senior in high school. One thing was well known in our neighborhood, and that's that the Pattersons hated their next-door neighbors. I never found out who started it, but the families went at it like animals. The police were called more times than I can count, often for stupid minor things like noise complaints. The Pattersons even called the cops once because the dad thought someone dumped leaves on his lawn, but it was really just from the trees. The son Darren had a bad reputation in our area as well. My parents always told me not to talk to him, even though I was way younger and probably wouldn't have anyway. I don't know everything he was up to, but one event still stands out. One morning I was walking to the bus stop for school. I noticed that one of our electrical transformers was smashed. These transformers looked like big metal boxes on the side of the road. I honestly didn't know what they were at the time, but this one was in rough shape. I asked my parents about it, but they didn't know. Eventually I found out that Darren crashed his dad's car into it. The accident was caught on someone's security camera. Darren was arrested under suspicion of drunk driving because he was all over the road, swerving wildly. Unfortunately, he got off, because by the time the cops got to him, it was too late to test him. Another time about a year later, I was at home alone for an afternoon. My dad was working, and my mom had left to take my sister somewhere. I was in my room upstairs doing some homework, with the TV on in the background. Then there was a knock on the small window next to our front door. That was weird, because most people would use the doorbell. I walked to the top of the stairs, where I could see down to where the noise came from. There was someone standing there, but from that angle, I couldn't tell who it was. I didn't bother going down, because the person looked too old to be one of my friends. I wasn't scared, just uninterested. I walked back to my room and picked up where I left off. About 2 minutes later, I heard another knock coming from the back of the house. It was on one of the windows by our deck. This time I walked down the stairs, because I was curious about who it was. When I turned the corner, the back windows came into view. I saw Mr. Patterson standing there on our back porch, looking in the window. This may not sound scary so far, but remember that our families were not friendly with each other. There was really no reason for him to come to our house, especially not into our backyard. I turned around and got out of sight as fast as possible. When I was in the other room, I was pretty sure that I could hear him try to open the door. I wanted to call my mom, but I knew she would be home soon anyway. I waited for another 10 minutes or so, and then her car pulled into the driveway. I told her what happened, and when my dad came home, we watched the footage on our security camera. It showed our neighbor walking up to our house, knocking on the window like I said, but the really creepy part is that it showed him trying to open the door, which was locked. Luckily he didn't break in or anything, but I was pretty scared. My dad went over to confront Mr. Patterson. He denied the whole thing at first, but when my dad screamed that he had video evidence, he just made up some BS excuse. He told my dad that he was checking on me. He said that I was too young to be left home alone, even though I was 13 and it was just for half an hour. Anyway, how would he have even known? Was he watching our house, waiting for me to be left alone? Things got better with them for a while. Nobody moved out until after I moved out, so those were my neighbors for the majority of my life. The son, Darren, ended up getting arrested a few years later. He had picked a fight on the street and gotten in trouble for assault and some other minor crimes. He didn't do any jail time. For how messed up the men were in the family, the mom always seemed really nice and normal. Same with her daughter. I didn't know Sam very well, but I would see her playing basketball on the driveway sometimes, and she seemed nice. That's about all I can say about the Pattersons. I don't know what he wanted in our house. I still have a hard time believing that he would actually hurt me, but why else would he try to sneak into our house while I was alone? I'm just glad the door was locked. This happened at my old apartment a few years ago. It was one of those new condo buildings downtown, the kind of place that looks like some modern art exhibit on the outside. It was basically all glass on the exterior, with balconies for every unit. I rented the place from a friend of mine, who bought the unit a few years out of college. She took a job in another city, and decided to rent it out as an investment, rather than selling. I was looking for a new place around that time, so it was a perfect fit for both of us. She gave me a good deal since we were friends, and she knew I would take good care of it. I knew some of the neighbors already from when I used to visit. Some of them were my age, and at first, it was like a little community. My place was on the 18th floor, and there was a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room. Off the bedroom was a small balcony, and there were windows on either side of it. Actually, every exterior wall was pretty much floor-to-ceiling windows. After the first year, my neighbor moved out. He was a quiet guy in his 30s that was nice enough. The guy who took his place was a little older, and he gave me a bad feeling right away. He had long hair and always wore a baseball hat. When he first moved in, I introduced myself and found out that his name was Liam. Liam worked from home, and I don't think he ever left other than to go to the store. I would hear some strange noises coming from his place from time to time. Sometimes out of nowhere, I would hear him yell out the F word and other curses. The walls there were thick, so I know he must have been yelling loud. I don't know for sure if it was a really bad anger problem, or maybe he was a passionate sports fan. I know some people get pretty into those games. Unfortunately, it seemed more like the former. One night, I was lying in bed. It wasn't that late, maybe it was around 8 o'clock. It wasn't completely dark out yet, but the sun was almost down. I was scrolling on my phone, and my balcony door was off to my left. Suddenly, I noticed something move out of the corner of my eye. It looked to be something outside my window. I put my phone down and turned to look, but it was gone. I thought it was a bird, but that was rare on the 18th floor in my city. After looking out the window for a minute, I gave up and forgot about it. Another night about a week later, I went out with some friends. I was the designated driver, so I didn't drink. When my friends were having their last round, though, I ordered a coffee just to make sure I would be awake enough to drive everyone home. Therefore, when I finally got to my place, I wasn't ready to go to sleep. I stayed up for about an hour watching TV, but when the clock struck 3 a.m., I decided it was time to go to bed. I still wasn't tired, though. By 4 a.m., I still couldn't fall asleep. That coffee seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was really keeping me up. I was lying on my side facing the window. The city skyline looked good at night, and I was watching it as I tried to doze off. Suddenly, I thought I noticed something. It was a blinking red light on the other side of my window, just to the side of my balcony. I watched it for a few seconds, not sure what I was seeing. It wasn't clear whether it was close or far away, but when it shifted up suddenly, I knew it was close. I rolled out of bed and walked over to the window. When I got there, I could see that it was a camera on some kind of a selfie stick, it seemed. Maybe it was a GoPro, or it could have been a regular camera, but I knew my neighbor was spying on me. Seconds after I saw it, it was jerked out of sight in the direction of Liam's apartment. I freaked out pretty hard right there and called the cops. To my shock, they didn't do anything right away. Apparently my word wasn't enough to search his place. I stayed with my mom for the next few days because I was too scared to be at home. I was sure to tell my neighbors what he did though. When I moved back to my apartment, Liam was still there, but fortunately, he didn't last long. I don't know how, but the cops finally managed to raid his place. The extent of what he was up to is not clear, but spying was not the only illegal stuff he was doing. The cyber crimes unit in my city was monitoring him as well. Once he was arrested, I never saw him again. I was allowed to see the footage he had of me, but I declined. There was no reason for me to do that to myself. The police also told me that they didn't believe he ever shared it publicly, so that was good for me. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to me, to have my privacy violated like that. Even though Liam was gone, I started looking for a new place right away. When my friend found out what happened, she was more than happy to let me break my lease. Before I bought my house, I lived in some sketchy places near some sketchy people. I could go on and on about some of the things that happened to me through my 20s and early 30s, but this one is the worst. I had a small apartment in an old building. That's where I lived when I finished high school. I was working at an auto shop doing oil changes mostly, and the pay was barely above minimum wage. Therefore, this was the only place I could afford without getting roommates, something I desperately wanted to avoid. My place was literally a single room, with a kitchen in one corner. My bed was right in the middle of the room, because there was no better place to put it, otherwise it would be blocking the door. I was happy enough at first, but the real problem was the neighbors. Since the building was old, you could hear everything. I don't know why old buildings are so bad like that. Maybe sound insulation wasn't invented yet, or maybe it was poor maintenance. All I know is that my apartment was constantly flooded with other people's conversations, footsteps, and every other noise you can imagine. My neighbors on one side were a married couple in their 30s. They were particularly loud, and they argued all the time, often late into the night. The man was Joshua, and he was a lawyer. The woman was Jane, and she was a receptionist. At the time when this happened, Joshua had been out of work for over a year. Money was one of the main things they fought over. Their fights became a regular thing that I would expect in my evenings, and I would often try to drown them out with music or TV shows. It wasn't just their yelling either. I would hear things being thrown occasionally as well. I could never tell if there was any physical violence, but I was always worried. Whenever I would see the two of them in public, it was like they were a perfect couple. They always put on a happy face for me and the others in the building, but we all knew what was going on behind closed doors, to some extent anyway. I could never understand why they did this. They must have known that people could hear them. I was never sure exactly how much to tolerate before calling the cops. I had never stepped in before this incident, but I was close a few times. About a month before this happened, I woke up in the middle of the night when one of them must have thrown something at the wall. It was a loud crash and a shatter, so I think it was a glass. I almost called the cops, but stopped because things seemed to calm down soon after. Another night, they were arguing like usual. I remember sitting on my couch, trying to listen to some music, but the noise was so much that even my over-ear headphones couldn't stop it. I turned up the volume and managed to mostly ignore it for the next hour. By around 11, the noise had stopped. I was getting ready for bed, and I didn't hear anything else from them. By the time I went to bed, I figured they had done the same, because it was quiet. As I was laying there trying to sleep, I heard a sound that may have been a gunshot. Then a woman started crying. I knew it was Jane. For a moment, I lay there in shock. Then I got off my bed and laid on the floor for safety. I didn't know if these walls could stop a bullet. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my hands trembling as I explained what I heard. I remember my voice cracking as I spoke, and I tried to keep as quiet as possible so no one would hear me. The operator told me that help was on the way, and that I shouldn't do anything else. I followed their advice, moving away from the wall, which I shared with the couple. In the time since the gunshot, I heard crying and whimpering from Jane, but nothing from Joshua. It was an ominous feeling being there and listening. I kept praying that I would hear yelling again, but that never happened. With each passing second, I feared more and more that Joshua was dead. Soon later, I heard the cops approaching the building. The sound grew louder until it stopped right outside. I peeked through the window, saw police cars and an ambulance parked outside. I stayed away from my door, listening as the police knocked on the couple's apartment. It sounded like 10 or 20 people must have rushed into their place. Police, EMTs, and such. There were voices, but I wasn't listening closely. It was just standard police stuff anyway. Jane was crying and not making much sense. After some time, I heard Jane being escorted out of the building, but I couldn't tell if she was under arrest. The tension in the air was palpable, and I found myself pacing in the apartment, trying to calm down. The next day, I learned from another neighbor that the woman next door had in fact been arrested for shooting Joshua. I was called in as a witness because Jane claimed the shot was in self-defense. I thought that didn't make any sense because before the shot, it was basically silent. If it happened in the heat of a fight, then maybe self-defense would be believable. I told the cops what I heard, and several of my other neighbors did the same. Joshua was in serious condition for several weeks, but he eventually died of his injury. Based on my statements and several others, Jane was ultimately charged with murdering her husband. The trial is scheduled for early next year, but I'm hoping that I don't have to testify.